Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Loki episode 5. Let's talk about it. So unfortunately today I don't actually have a lot of time for this review because I'm trying to pack in a review for Loki episode 5 as well as my review for Black Widow, which is coming up next. So this is gonna be a rush, okay, because once again it's like the middle of the night. I had to go see Black Widow in the cinema. It was a whole situation. England were playing in the Euros. The streets were wild. The streets were crazy. So I'm happy that I made it home safe, okay, because there was some unsavory characters out there, and I'm here to finally talk about Loki episode 5 with you guys. But unfortunately, because I am in such a rush, I can't really go through some of you guys' comments from last week's video. But please still feel free to share your comments down below, share your thoughts on this week's episode of Loki, and let me know what you think will happen in the next episode, the final episode of this series. As per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, let's dive into my thoughts on Loki episode 5. So first of all, this episode actually opens up with the end credits scene that we saw at the end of last week's episode. It's pretty much a replay of that very same scene, and a lot of people online, including some of the producers of the actual show, pointed out that that scene is kind of paying homage to the end of the first Avengers film, where Loki is defeated in Avengers Tower and he's looking up at the Avengers as they hover above him menacingly. That's kind of declaring his moment of defeat. But this time around, when he looks up, he sees other versions of himself, and these are the characters that we follow throughout this episode. And first of all, I wanted to start off my review talking about my ranking, talking about my thoughts on these various versions of Loki. But before we dive into my official ranking, I did just want to say that overall this was more of what I expected the series to be when I saw the trailer for the show. I expected more of this, more input from these various versions of Loki, seeing these different versions from different timelines, getting up to all this shenanigans, seeing their dynamics and the way that they interacted with one another and the similarities between them, as well as some of the differences. This is what I wanted when I was excited for the series after seeing the trailer. And so for it to come in episode 5 is a little bit disappointing to me. We have had hints at this, especially in episode 2, where we saw the holograms of the various versions of Loki that are calling back to some comic book references, as well as some real world references in the case of the Lance Armstrong Loki. So we did get a little sprinkling of that earlier, and of course we saw Loki as DB Cooper earlier as well in episode 1. But in this episode is when we really get to see like real life versions of Loki, of this character, some of whom are even played by Tom Hiddleston again, which I love to see. So this is the part that really excited me about this episode overall. And now we can go through my thoughts on each various version of the main team of Lokis that we follow throughout the episode. First of all, when it comes to my official ranking of these specific Lokis, at the bottom I would put Boastful Loki. He turned out to be a bit of a disappointment. I was excited to see a black, powerful Thor-like Loki. I suspected that he was trying to imitate his version of Thor, and that's why he was so hench and that's why he was so boastful as well. And also that's why he wields this fake Mjolnir, because he tried to replicate Thor's hammer somehow. Like, that was my theory, and it still may be the case, but we didn't really get his story expanded upon in this episode, unfortunately. And again, that just speaks to how they kind of crammed this premise that I was looking forward to, the idea of exploring different versions of Loki. They crammed that into one episode, and not even the full episode was dedicated to that, because we have the overall storylines at play here as well. So for me, it was kind of unfortunate that we didn't get a chance to dive into each of these various versions of the character in any depth. But a clear casual casualty of that was, of course, the boastful Loki, who's right at the bottom. He ends up betraying the gang, including his king, Kid Loki. And, you know, it's a very predictable Loki move. It just speaks to how, you know, these very similar character traits, you know, are found throughout the various versions of Loki across the different timelines. And as our version of Loki looks on and sees these betrayals, these backstabbings, he's just like, seriously, like, is this all that I am? Like, it's just depressing to him. He's just looking around at President Loki, Viking Loki, various versions of Loki, and he's like, for real, guys, like, betrayal, really? Again, even though we don't really dive into the character of boastful Loki in any real depth, he's kind of a representative, the kind of the domino that started it all when it comes to the backstabbing and the betrayals that each of these Lokis have exhibited at some point in time. Okay, so next up on my list, we have Kid Loki. Now, I was super excited to see Kid Loki brought to life, okay? I haven't read the comics, as I often say on my channel, but I have seen various versions of Kid Loki portrayed by some incredible artists on Tumblr. Incredible artists on Tumblr and on the internet at large. So I was really excited to see what they would do with this version of the character on the small screen. And I think he is a very good Kid Loki. I don't think he quite has the charisma. Like, I just wanted to pull out a bit more charisma to him, but I do think he's very likable. I do think that the actor did a good job. It's tough because you're acting against Tom Hiddleston, who's like Loki. Like, he's the originator of Loki, at least on the big screen, and so it's tough to like act against him as a version of his character that he made iconic. But I do think that the actor rose to the occasion and for the most part really did a good job of portraying this version of Loki. I just personally expected a bit more of a cheeky Loki because he's so young. I expected him to be a little bit more mischievous. Like, we keep calling Loki the god of mischief, but I'm not seeing a lot of mischief. Like, I see either like an evil Loki, a jealous Loki, a lonely Loki. I haven't seen a lot of mischievous Lokis. So I expected Kid Loki to kind of embody that a little bit more. But it turns out in this version of events, Kid Loki is actually the king amongst their little group because he holds the, I guess the title, I guess the esteem of being the only Loki who managed to kill his version of Thor. Now, I don't know what that story was, and again, I wish the series would delve into it. That plot line seems a lot more interesting than the one that we're getting overall, in my opinion, but whatever. I don't know what happened there, but it seems as though, you know, he was able to defeat this formidable foe, and that's something that I guess the Lokis have mixed feelings about, because some of these Lokis, as we'll see in the case of classic Loki, have an appreciation and a love for Thor, their brother. So it's not as if all of them are in that same level of intensity of hatred towards Thor, but they still hold that respect of like, okay, you were able to take down Thor, fair enough. Like you see that moment where classic Loki reveals to our Loki that Kid Loki killed his version of Thor, and our Loki is just like, mad. Our Loki's just like, okay. I'll back up, like, respect. Okay, so next up on my list, of course, you must have seen this coming. It's Alligator Loki. Who else? It must be Alligator Loki. Alligator Loki is a VIP. Alligator Loki was a scene stealer. Every time I saw him, I was like, yup, like, we were vibing. He was the best Loki, okay, in lots of ways. But I really loved this iteration of the character. He just brought about, you know, these kind of moments of humor and absurdity, and it just kind of brought home just how crazy this whole situation is. I actually wish that there were more instances of animal Lokis. We could have gotten a black cat Loki with like green eyes. I think that would have been a perfect animal version of this character. Just a little black cat with like the horns, the gold horns. I think that would have been great. So yeah, again, I wish they leaned into this premise a little bit more, but still we have the story that we've got, so we're gonna have to deal with it. We'll discuss that later on in this review. But next up in the lineup is in fact Alligator Loki. I will say though, it was kind of curious to me. It was kind of curious to see how surprised our Loki was, or at least kind of befuddled by the presence of alligator Loki, considering that he himself is a shapeshifter. And that is actually the case not just in the comics and not just in Norse mythology, but in the MCU itself, because Thor in Thor Ragnarok told that story about how Loki once shapeshifted into a snake because he knew that Thor loved snakes, and then he ended up kind of biting him in the face and like scaring Thor. So we know that Loki has turned into reptiles before, so it shouldn't be that much of a surprise that there is a living alligator version of him. And finally, out of this little gang, my favorite version of Loki that we got in this episode was, of course, Richard E. Grant's classic Loki. He's wearing the classic Loki costume as he appeared in the comics, first in like the mid 20th century. And honestly, I think that Richard E. Grant is the perfect actor to portray a version of Loki, especially an elder version of Tom Hiddleston's Loki. I think he's just perfectly cast in this role. I actually felt I felt some type of way about the costume, okay, because on the one hand, I get it, it's like comic book accurate, blah blah blah, but I've often said on this channel that just because it's comic book accurate doesn't mean it needs to be there. Like, if it looks bad, it looks bad. Like, we can scrap it, but of course we have to pay our respects to the comics that started it all, so we need to have this stupid costume. But I feel like it did somewhat of a disservice to the actor's incredible performance as Loki. Richard E. Grant did the research, he did the extra reading, he did the homework, he got an A++ on his assignment, because let me tell you, there were mannerisms in his performance that very much echoed that of Tom Hiddleston's Loki. And I know that Tom Hiddleston had that whole symposium as Anthony Mackie referred to it as, this whole symposium about the character of Loki, and perhaps Richard E. Grant was there. That would make sense, but he was paying attention, he was taking down notes, because that little grin that he has very much gave me Tom Hiddleston's Loki vibes. And I think he did an excellent job of, you know, portraying a version of that character that is more linked than the other versions that we saw, especially in this group, whilst at the same time adding that extra layer of maturity and experience that came with his age and came with his kind of divergence from these timeline that Loki's, well, our version of Loki is headed towards. And another thing that I really loved about this character and respected about this character is the way that it actually addressed some of the issues that I had with our version of Loki and how he's been portrayed on the show, and that is the inconsistency in his powers. Because my thinking is, this is a god. He's the god of mischief, okay? He's not a jester, he's an actual god, okay? There's a reason why the people in Scandinavia decided to label these individuals as gods. It's because they had powers that human beings had never seen before. But why do we rarely see these powers? Why do we rarely see these powers be used for grand things? Instead, Tom Hiddleston's version of Loki is making blankets, is making fireworks, doing small things with his powers, and his power set isn't clearly defined. But then we have Richard E. Grant's classic Loki, giving us a taste of what I wanted for our Loki from the very beginning, which is just ultimate power, just oozing green energy to the point where he's able to recreate Asgard, recreate a manifestation of Asgard in order to distract that monster. I thought that was an excellent sequence. This is what I wanted for our Loki from the beginning, but no, instead we got little tricks, little magician tricks. But here we have Richard E. Grant's character, first of all, giving the actor ring of a lifetime, trying to portray this powerful being, okay, but secondly, actually using his magic in a way that feels like it's worthy of being labeled godlike. Do you know what I mean? That's all that I'm asking for. I'm not asking for parlor tricks, I'm asking for this, and I love the fact that it was delivered in this episode. Hate the fact that he died though. Hate the fact that he died. It seems as though Lokis aren't the only ones who are losing throughout this series, because so am I. He dies in the same episode that he's introduced. Heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. He was my favorite Loki by far, especially within this group. Although I will say, honorable mention to my guy President Loki. Listen, Listen, the second that I saw President Loki, you know, when Loki was looking up at the drain when they were in that hideout, okay, the second I saw him, I was like, first of all, I was shocked because we'd seen him in the trailers and we'd all assumed that it was our version of Loki, you know, getting up to mischief. But no, there's no mischief on this show. So of course that wasn't the case. Instead, it's another version of Loki. And the second I saw him, I was like, hang on. This is the Loki I wanted. This is the Loki I wanted. This is the Loki that I expected. Something crazy happened because he's portrayed by the same actor. How does that work? How does that work? He's portrayed by the same actor, but the second I saw Tom Hiddleston's face on this version of Loki, I was like, no, this is the one. So we meet President Loki when all of the Lokis are in this bunker that they have, and he just steps in, and apparently he's made a deal with Boastful Loki. And Boastful Loki was supposed to take over his army in exchange for some provisions and food and stuff, but of course, President Loki decides to stab Boastful Loki in the back, and then you have that whole scuffle. But let me tell you, I loved President Loki's whole aura. I loved his energy. I loved his vibe. I thought his aesthetic as well. I think he looked like the best Loki, like visually speaking, he looked the best. I was just such a fan. I'm heartbroken that once again, we likely won't be seeing him again throughout this series, considering that the next episode is the finale. That's just heartbreaking to me. Now, since we're already talking about the characters before we delve into the overall plot, let me just carry on. Now that I've given you guys my kind of score of the best Lokis, the best variants of Lokis that we got in this episode, now we can focus on our main guy, our version of Loki who lands himself in the void. This kind of vast world, this field that's just been abandoned and seems to be the kind of dumping ground for everything that the TVA prunes. However, a lot of the people in the TVA don't even have the knowledge that when they're pruning someone or something, it ends up in this void, in the dumping ground. But of course, Judge Renslayer knew all about it, and ultimately you see a ton of Easter eggs. Okay, this episode was Easter egg heavy, and unfortunately I'm not one of those channels that can sit there watching Loki frame by frame and, you know, researching every single Easter egg and the meaning of every single thing that appears here. I have seen people online mentioning these various Easter eggs, like there's this Thanos helicopter that people went crazy over. Apparently it's a storyline from the comics. Like, okay, good for you. Good for you, that seems cute. Okay, there was one Easter egg that I did get. Okay, there was one, and it was to do with President Loki, because I was paying attention then because he was my fave. Anyway, it was with President Loki where he gets his hand bitten off by Crocodile Loki, and I couldn't help but notice that seems to be a kind of reference to Captain Hook, who Tom Hiddleston actually voiced in like Tinkerbell the Pirate Fairy, I think the film is called. He voiced him in an animated film. I feel like that's a reference to that because he gets his hand chopped off by the alligator, even though I believe in the original Peter Pan story it's a crocodile, but still, same thing. So that's one reference that I did get. Again, this episode was heavy with the Easter eggs, both from the comics and also from pop culture. Again, just like we saw in episode 1 with Loki portraying DB Cooper, we see a lot of references to things that went missing in the Bermuda Triangle, especially ships. We also see some UFOs. We also see, you know, all kinds of references to the comics, like Thanos' helicopter from something. Again, I'm just listing off things that people were talking about on Twitter, so I won't really be able to tell you guys about that with a lot of knowledge, but you can just Google it and you will find a ton of channels who have combed through each and every frame of this episode and will be able to tell you about all of those references. And to that I say, that's great. If you're the kind of person who delves into all of that in that much depth, then I think you'll get a lot from this episode. However, on the flip side of that, I feel like if you're not that kind of person and you don't understand a lot of these references, then maybe a lot of the episode will be lost on you. It won't have that same impact. I definitely feel like it was the case for me, where I saw these objects, like these artifacts that are scattered around, and I know they're probably references to something, but I don't have that connection, so that's not really something something that I'm focused on. But anyways, going back to our version of Loki, this episode was all about Loki, first of all, seeing different versions of himself, and once again, the similarities, the differences, and also, you know, the role that he plays within all of these various timelines and how similar they are. The fact that he seems to be there solely to kind of prop up others, as was explained in episode 1 in the case of the Avengers, and he sees how, you know, he makes the same mistakes time and time again in order to fulfill this purpose within these timelines, or the sacred timeline, and it kind of depresses him and it kind of annoys him. He becomes frustrated with himself, like, oh my god, I'm living in a nightmare. I'm just seeing these various versions of himself exhibit the same behaviors time and time again. Like, he's over it. He's over it, okay? And we heard him say something similar in episode 2, I believe it was, or 3, where he was like, I understand what Thor was on about now. I'm a little bit annoying. And I feel like in this episode he feels that tenfold, considering that he is surrounded by 10 times more Lokis. But ultimately, when the going gets tough, we do see Loki's character arc throughout this series be fulfilled, and he has this big hero moment where he helps Sylvie get rid of the Alaya, the monster that's kind of hovering over this void, and apparently it's basically the guard dog to whoever created the TVA in the first place. We find that out later on where Sylvie joins the gang, but it is really nice to see Loki, our version of Loki, going through this character arc. I will say that, you know, if there's one thing that this series has done right, is kind of following through with the themes of who Loki really is, his role in the sacred timeline, and also these kind of repetitive patterns that he wants to break out of, especially considering that he just came out of one in the form of the first Avengers film. I do feel like these themes surrounding the character of Loki and trying to bring him to a point where he appreciates and loves himself, he no longer feels like he's, you know, hiding in his brother's shadow anymore, and he has to force himself out by doing all of these evil and mischievous things. At this point, he's starting to come to terms with who he could be outside of his brother's shadow and outside of all of the insecurities that he had previously, and that's a part that I do feel like works really well when it comes to his character arc in this series so far, and we see that culminate in the events that happen at the end of this episode, where he helps Sylvie enchant the Alaya and, you know, get through it, kind of part the Alaya like Moses parted the Red Sea and it leads them straight towards this kind of creepy mansion situation that will lead us into the next week's episode, where we likely find out who was behind the TVA all along. Now, speaking of who was behind the TVA all along, there have been various theories surrounding who could be behind the TVA. I, for one, thought that someone like Judge Renslayer could be behind the TVA because of the parallels between the series and Snowpiercer, and the idea that she would kind of parallel the character that Jennifer Connelly plays in Snowpiercer, who actually ends up being the conductor of the train. So perhaps in this case, Judge Renslayer would be the conductor of the TVA. That's looking very unlikely at this point in time, because she seems just as confused as the rest of us. Like, she's also feeling a little bit betrayed or a little bit annoyed, because it turns out that everything she believed about the TVA was incorrect. She was in that room when it was revealed that the timekeepers were nothing but mindless droids, so she also has questions of her own, but she's gonna have to work real hard if she wants to beat Sylvie to finding out those answers, because according to Hunter B15, one reason why she will likely fail is because she only wants these answers, but Sylvie needs them because they have defined her entire life. She has been on the run her entire life because of the TVA and because of Judge Renslayer, and so she will not stop until she finds out who was behind this all along. Whereas Judge Renslayer is probably just like, yeah, this is annoying, but you can tell that she's still upholding the rules, the dogma as she called it. And again, it goes back to the religious connotations that I talked about a couple of videos ago, but she's still upholding the dogma, the teachings that have been fed to them, because even after she finds out the truth about you know, the mechanical timekeepers, you know, the timekeepers being fake, she doesn't turn around and tell the rest of the TVA like, oh, by the way, when you prune someone, it basically means that they're just going off to the void, they're not actually going to die. Like, the rest of the TVA are still under the impression that when Sylvie prunes herself at the beginning of the episode, she basically he committed suicide. But, you know, Judge Renslayer knows that's not the case, but she doesn't correct them. So it's interesting to see how, even though she knows the truth now about the timekeepers, because apparently she didn't know previously, she's still there to kind of uphold this same dogma, the same teachings, and the same brainwashing that existed before. It's just that she wants to know who's really behind it, perhaps so that they can work more collaboratively and she can still remain in a position of power. But anyways, going back to the theory surrounding who could be behind the TVA to begin with, people have said many things. People have said it's, you know, Judge Renslayer, maybe it's Miss Minutes. Although again, from this episode, it's looking unlikely because Miss Minutes just looks like this kind of animated version of a receptionist or like a secretary or something. And of course, a lot of people have been guessing from the beginning that Kang was behind all of this because of the way that a lot of the sculptures of the timekeepers resembled the character from the comics. And of course, we do know that Jonathan Majors has been cast in the role for Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, so it made sense if he would be introduced in this series and then we would get more of him in that film. I, for one, was a little bit skeptical of this just because looking at the formula of these series so far, you know, these series don't tend to delve in deep when it comes to pulling out comic book villains. We suspected already that Mephisto will be behind it all in WandaVision, or again, a lot of people suspected that they would get this kind of strange out of the box version of the Power Broker in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but in both instances the big bads turned out to be the people that were right under our noses the whole time. So it makes sense to me that that trend would continue for the series of Loki, and who better to be behind the TVA and be dumping Lokis in a dumping ground instead of, you know, eradicating them, because apparently they can't, than a Loki himself. I feel like I feel like in this case it was Loki all along. I'm not saying that Loki or this version of Loki created the TVA from the beginning, or certainly didn't create the sacred timeline, but perhaps this version of Loki, you know, took over from whoever was previously in charge. I feel like that would make sense, especially considering that in this episode Loki points out that the distinguishing factor between, you know, all the other Lokis and Sylvie is that Sylvie wants to take down the TVA. She wants to eradicate the TVA, as opposed to all the other Lokis that would likely want to take it over. So it makes sense then that if there is a Loki out there who's powerful enough to take charge from whoever actually created the sacred timeline, he would be in charge of the TVA behind the scenes. It would kind of follow on the kind of Wizard of Oz theme of this series as well. And yeah, I just feel like it would be a good twist and it wouldn't come out of completely nowhere because we've been following various versions of the character already. Whereas in the case of another comic book character like Kang or He Who Remains, that a lot of people have been saying may also be behind the TVA in this series, I feel like no one knows who these characters are. Like, no one knows who these characters are. We're 3 shows in. I feel like at this point it's safe to say that Kevin Feige is not going to introduce a whole comic book character that no one knows in the last episode of a series. I feel like that is very, very unlikely to happen. And if it does happen, it will be a shame because it won't have the same impact that it's supposed to for most people who don't know who Kang or He Who Remains are. Next up, I did also want to talk about the character of Sylvie. I've talked about how I haven't been wholly convinced by the romance that's developed between Loki and Sylvie throughout this series. I still feel the same way. I do understand that the director has said that the relationship between them is more friendship as opposed to a romantic relationship, but we've seen Marvel portray a good male-female friendship before in the case of Natasha and Steve. Okay, Natasha and Steve were an excellent version of a male-female friendship that we scarcely see. I do feel like that was carried out really well. Perhaps it's because the actors are friends in real life, like Chris Evans and Scarlett Johansson are friends. And maybe that chemistry just kind of played through in Captain America the Winter Soldier really well. Whereas in the case of, you know, Tom Hiddleston and Sophia Di Martino, we know maybe they're just trying to figure out that chemistry, but I don't get strong platonic vibes. I get very much romantic vibes, the lingering stares, the sharing the blanket. Again, why is he using his powers to make a blanket? Disappointing. Anyway, the sharing the blanket, I'm just like, that to me, I don't know, there's something about it that doesn't scream friendship. So I'm not the biggest kind of proponent of this relationship. I understand it's there to kind of set up the idea that Loki is no longer alone, but we already have Morbius for that. And finally, I did want to talk about the action sequence itself. It's a CGI boss battle. It's a CGI boss battle. We've seen many of them at this point, and to be fair, because I do try to be fair, okay, I often talk about how I'm not a fan of the DCEU's gross, desaturated CG kind of aesthetic, especially during the action sequences that we see in some of the DCEU films. I talk about this often. I talk about this frequently, okay, and I have to kind of, you know, be fair, like I said, and say that I got similar vibes in this episode with the clouds. With the actual Apple Cloud being the villain of this episode. Like, okay. The whole time I was just sitting there thinking, like, I swear this monster could be taken down by a gust of wind. Like, but anyway, there's a purple cloud, that's the bad guy, and it turns green in the end to symbolize how Loki and Sylvie have been able to enchant it somehow. How are you able to enchant a cloud? How does that work? Does it have a nervous system? Does it have a brain that you can take over? What's going on there? Fine, let me not even... But they're able to enchant it, and in the end, like I said, it's parted, and we get to see the path towards whoever created the TVA to begin with, who I suspect is a Loki, or perhaps a Kang the Conqueror, whatever. If I'm wrong, then fine. Again, I'll still be disappointed because it will just be out of nowhere, and it won't have the impact for people who don't know about the comic books and the characters in the comics. So I feel like it would just be a useless plot twist for a lot of people. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Loki episode 5, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.